Chapter 19 of Leviathan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. Chapter 19. Of the several kinds of Commonwealth by institution, and of succession to the sovereign power. The difference of Commonwealths consisteth in the difference of the sovereign, or the person representative of all and every one of the multitude; and because the sovereignty is either in one man, or in an assembly of more than one, and into that assembly either every man hath right to enter, or not every one but certain men distinguished from the rest, it is manifest there can be but three kinds of Commonwealth. For the representative must needs be one man, or more; and if more, then it is the assembly of all, or but of a part. When the representative is one man, then is the Commonwealth a monarchy; when an assembly of all that will come together, then it is a democracy, or popular Commonwealth; when an assembly of a part only, then it is called an aristocracy. Other kind of Commonwealth there can be none, for either one, or more, or all must have the sovereign power, which I have shown to be indivisible, entire. There be other names of government in the histories and books of policy, as tyranny and oligarchy; but they are not the names of other forms of government, but of the same forms misliked. For they that are discontented under monarchy call it tyranny, and they that are displeased with aristocracy call it oligarchy. So also they which find themselves grieved under a democracy call it anarchy, which signifies want of government. And yet I think no man believes that want of government is any new kind of government; nor by the same reason ought they to believe that the government is of one kind when they like it, and another when they mislike it, or are oppressed by the governors. It is manifest that men who are in absolute liberty may, if they please, give authority to one man to represent them every one, as well as give such authority to any assembly of men whatsoever; and consequently may subject themselves, if they think good, to a monarch as absolutely as to other representative. Therefore, where there is already erected a sovereign power, there can be no other representative of the same people, but only to certain particular ends, by the sovereign limited. For that were to erect two sovereigns, and every man to have his person represented by two actors that, by opposing one another, must needs divide that power, which, if men will live in peace, is indivisible; and thereby reduce the multitude into the condition of war, contrary to the end for which all sovereignty is instituted. And therefore, as it is absurd to think that a sovereign assembly, inviting the people of their dominion to send up their deputies with power to make known their advice or desires, should therefore hold such deputies, rather than themselves, for the absolute representative of the people, so it is absurd also to think the same in a monarchy. And I know not how this so manifest a truth should of late be so little observed, that in a monarchy he that had the sovereignty from a descent of 600 years was alone called sovereign, had the title of majesty from every one of his subjects, and was unquestionably taken by them for their king, was notwithstanding never considered as their representative; that name without contradiction passing for the title of those men which at his command were sent up by the people to carry their petitions, and give him, if he permitted it, their advice; which may serve as an admonition for those that are the true and absolute representative of a people, to instruct men in the nature of that office, and to take heed how they admit of any other general representation upon any occasion whatsoever, if they mean to discharge the trust committed to them. The difference between these three kinds of Commonwealth consisteth not in the difference of power, but in the difference of convenience or aptitude to produce the peace and security of the people, for which end they were instituted. And to compare monarchy with the other two, we may observe, first, that whosoever beareth the person of the people, or is one of that assembly that bears it, beareth also his own natural person; and though he be careful in his politic person to procure the common interest, yet he is more, or no less, careful to procure the private good of himself, his family, kindred, and friends; and for the most part, if the public interest chance to cross the private, he prefers the private; for the passions of men are commonly more potent than their reason. From whence it follows, that where the public and private interest are most closely united, there is the public most advanced. Now in monarchy the private interest is the same with the public. The riches, power, and honor of a monarch arise only from the riches, strength, and reputation of his subjects. For no king can be rich, nor glorious, nor secure, whose subjects are either poor, or contemptible, or too weak through want, or dissension, to maintain a war against their enemies. Whereas in a democracy or aristocracy, the public prosperity confers not so much to the private fortune of one that is corrupt or ambitious, as doth many times a perfidious advice, a treacherous action, or a civil war. Secondly, that a monarch receiveth counsel of whom, when, and where he pleaseth, and consequently may hear the opinion of men versed in the matter about which he deliberates, of what rank or quality soever, and as long before the time of action and with as much secrecy as he will. But when a sovereign assembly has need of counsel, none are admitted but such as have a right thereto from the beginning, which for the most part are of those who have been versed more in the acquisition of wealth than of knowledge, and are to give their advice in long discourses which may, and do commonly, excite men to action, but not govern them in it. For the understanding is by the flame of the passions never enlightened, but dazzled; nor is there any place or time wherein an assembly can receive counsel secretly, because of their own multitude. Thirdly, that the resolutions of a monarch are subject to no other inconstancy than that of human nature; but in assemblies, besides that of nature, there ariseth an inconstancy from the number. For the absence of a few that would have the resolution, once taken, continue firm, which may happen by security, negligence, or private impediments, or the diligent appearance of a few of the contrary opinion, undoes today all that was concluded yesterday. Fourthly, that a monarch cannot disagree with himself out of envy or interest, but an assembly may, and that to such a height as may produce a civil war. Fifthly, that in monarchy there is this inconvenience, that any subject by the power of one man, for the enriching of a favourite or flatterer, may be deprived of all he possesseth, which I confess is a great and inevitable inconvenience. But the same may as well happen where the sovereign power is in an assembly; for their power is the same, and they are as subject to evil counsel, and to be seduced by orators, as a monarch by flatterers; and becoming one another's flatterers, serve one another's covetousness and ambition by turns. And whereas the favourites of monarchs are few, and they have none else to advance but their own kindred, the favourites of an assembly are many, and the kindred much more numerous than of any monarch. Besides, there is no favourite of a monarch which cannot as well succour his friends as hurt his enemies; but orators, that is to say, favourites of sovereign assemblies, though they have great powers to hurt, have little to save. For to accuse requires less eloquence, such is man's nature, than to excuse; and condemnation, than absolution, more resembles justice. Sixthly, that it is an inconvenience in monarchy, that the sovereignty may descend upon an infant, or one that cannot discern between good and evil; and consisteth in this, that the use of his power must be in the hand of another man, or of some assembly of men, which are to govern by his right, and in his name, as curators and protectors of his person and authority. But to say there is inconvenience in putting the use of the sovereign power into the hand of a man, or an assembly of men, is to say that all government is more inconvenient than confusion and civil war. And therefore all the danger that can be pretended must arise from the contention of those that, for an office of so great honour and profit, may become competitors. To make it appear that this inconvenience proceedeth not from that form of government we call monarchy, We are to consider that the precedent monarch hath appointed who shall have the tuition of his infant successor, either expressly by testament, or tacitly by not controlling the custom in that case received; and then such inconvenience, if it happen, is to be attributed, not to the monarchy, but to the ambition and injustice of the subjects, which in all kinds of government, where the people are not well instructed in their duty and the rights of sovereignty, is the same. Or else the precedent monarch hath not at all taken order for such tuition; and then the law of nature hath provided this sufficient rule, that the tuition shall be in him that hath by nature most interest in the preservation of the authority of the infant, and to whom least benefit can accrue by his death or diminution. For seeing every man by nature seeketh his own benefit and promotion, to put an infant into the power of those that can promote themselves by his destruction or damage is not tuition, but treachery. So that sufficient provision being taken against all just quarrel about the government under a child, if any contention arise to the disturbance of the public peace, it is not to be attributed to the form of monarchy, but to the ambition of subjects, and ignorance of their duty. On the other side, there is no great commonwealth, the sovereignty whereof is in a great assembly, which is not, as to consultations of peace and war and making of laws, in the same condition as if the government were in a child. For as a child wants the judgment to dissent from counsel given him, and is thereby necessitated to take the advice of them or him to whom he is committed, so an assembly wanteth the liberty to dissent from the counsel of the major part, be it good or bad. And as a child has need of a tutor, or protector, to preserve his person and authority, so also in great commonwealths the sovereign assembly, in all great dangers and troubles, have need of custodes libertatis, that is, of dictators, or protectors of their authority, which are as much as temporary monarchs, to whom for a time they may commit the entire exercise of their power, and have, at the end of that time, been oftener deprived thereof than infant kings by their protectors, regents, or any other tutors. Though the kinds of sovereignty be, as I have now shown, but three, that is to say, monarchy, where one man has it, or democracy, where the general assembly of subjects has it, or aristocracy, where it is in an assembly of certain persons nominated or otherwise distinguished from the rest, yet he that shall consider the particular commonwealths that have been and are in the world will not perhaps easily reduce them to three, and may thereby be inclined to think there be other forms arising from these mingled together; as for example elective kingdoms, where kings have the sovereign power put into their hands for a time; or kingdoms wherein the king hath a power limited, which governments are nevertheless by most writers called monarchy. Likewise, if a popular or aristocratical commonwealth subdue an enemy's country, and govern the same by a president, procurator, or other magistrate, this may seem perhaps at first sight to be a democratical or aristocratical government. But it is not so. For elective kings are not sovereigns, but ministers of the sovereign; nor limited kings sovereigns, but ministers of them that have the sovereign power; nor are those provinces which are in subjection to a democracy or aristocracy of another commonwealth, democratically or aristocratically governed, but monarchically. And first, concerning an elective king, whose power is limited to his life, as it is in many places of Christendom at this day, or to certain years or months, as the dictator's power amongst the Romans, if he have right to appoint his successor, he is no more elective, but hereditary. But if he have no power to elect his successor, then there is some other man, or assembly known, which after his decease may elect anew; or else the commonwealth dieth, or dissolveth with him, and returneth to the condition of war. If it be known who have the power to give the sovereignty after his death, it is known also that the sovereignty was in them before; for none have right to give that which they have not right to possess, and keep to themselves if they think good. But if there be none that can give the sovereignty after the decease of him that was first elected, then has he power, nay, he is obliged by the law of nature to provide, by establishing a successor, to keep to those that had trusted him with the government, from relapsing into the miserable condition of civil war. And consequently he was, when elected, a Soveraigne Absolute. Secondly, that King whose power is limited, is not superior to him, or them, that have the power to limit it; and he that is not superior, is not supreme; that is to say, not Soveraigne. The sovereignty therefore was always in that Assembly which had the right to limit him, and by consequence the government not monarchy, but either democracy or aristocracy; as of old times in Sparta, where the kings had a privilege to lead their armies, but the sovereignty was in the Ephorae. Thirdly, whereas heretofore the Roman people governed the land of Judea, for example, by a President, yet was not Judea therefore a democracy, because they were not governed by any assembly into which any of them had right to enter; nor by an aristocracy, because they were not governed by any assembly into which any man could enter by their election; but they were governed by one person, which though as to the people of Rome was an assembly of the people, or democracy, yet as to the people of Judea, which had no right at all of participating in the government, was a monarch. For though where the people are governed by an assembly chosen by themselves out of their own number, the government is called a democracy, or aristocracy, yet when they are governed by an assembly not of their own choosing, it is a monarchy; not of one man over another man, but of one people over another people. Of all these forms of government, the matter being mortal, so that not only monarchs but also whole assemblies die, it is necessary for the conservation of the peace of men, that as there was order taken for an artificial man, so there be order also taken for an artificial eternity of life; without which men that are governed by an assembly should return into the condition of war in every age, and they that are governed by one man, as soon as their governor dieth. This artificial eternity is that which men call the right of succession. There is no perfect form of government, where the disposing of the succession is not in the present Soveraigne. For if it be in any other particular man, or private assembly, it is in a person subject, and may be assumed by the Soveraigne at his pleasure; and consequently the right is in himself. And if it be in no particular man, but left to a new choice, then is the Common wealth dissolved, and the right is in him that can get it, contrary to the intention of them that did institute the Common wealth for their perpetual, and not temporary security. In a democracy the whole assembly cannot fail, unless the multitude that are to be governed fail; and therefore questions of the right of succession have in that form of government no place at all. In an aristocracy, when any of the assembly dieth, the election of another into his room belonged to the assembly, as the Soveraigne, to whom belongeth the choosing of all counsellors and officers. For that which the representative doth as actor, every one of the subjects doth as author. And though the Soveraigne Assembly may give power to others to elect new men, for supply of their court, yet it is still by their authority that the election is made, and by the same it may, when the public shall require it, be recalled. The greatest difficulty about the right of succession is in monarchy; and the difficulty ariseth from this, that at first sight it is not manifest who is to appoint the successor, nor many times who it is whom he hath appointed. For in both these cases there is required a more exact ratiocination than every man is accustomed to use. As to the question who shall appoint the successor of a monarch that hath the sovereign authority, that is to say, who shall determine of the right of inheritance, for elective kings and princes have not the sovereign power in propriety, but in use only, we are to consider, that either he that is in possession has right to dispose of the succession, or else that right is again in the dissolved multitude. For the death of him that hath the sovereign power and property, leaves the multitude without any sovereign at all; that is, without any representative in whom they should be united, and be capable of doing any one action at all; and therefore they are incapable of election of any new monarch, every man having equal right to submit himself to such as he thinks best able to protect him, or, if he can, protect himself by his own sword; which is a return to confusion, and to the condition of a war of every man against every man, contrary to the end for which monarchy had its first institution. Therefore it is manifest, that by the institution of Monarchy, the disposing of the successor is always left to the judgement and will of the present possessor. And for the question which may arise sometimes, who it is that the Monarch in possession hath designed to the succession and inheritance of his power, it is determined by his express words and testament, or by other tacit signs sufficient. By express words or testament, when it is declared by him in his lifetime, viva voce, or by writing; as the first Emperors of Rome declared who should be their heirs. For the word heir does not of itself imply the children or nearest kindred of a man, but whomsoever a man shall any way declare he would have to succeed him in his estate. If therefore a monarch declare expressly that such a man shall be his heir, either by word or writing, then is that man immediately after the decease of his predecessor invested in the right of being monarch. But where testament and express words are wanting, other natural signs of the will are to be followed, whereof the one is custom. And therefore where the custom is that the next of kindred absolutely succeedeth, there also the next of kindred hath right to the succession. For that if the will of him that was in possession had been otherwise, he might easily have declared the same in his lifetime. And likewise where the custom is that the next of the male kindred succeedeth, there also the right of succession is in the next of the kindred male, for the same reason. And so it is, if the custom were to advance the female. For whatsoever custom a man may by a word control, and does not, it is a natural sign he would have that custom stand. But where neither custom nor testament hath proceeded, there it is to be understood, first, that a monarch's will is that the government remain monarchical, because he hath approved that government in himself; secondly, that a child of his own, male or female, be preferred before any other, because men are presumed to be more inclined by nature to advance their own children than the children of other men; and of their own rather a male than a female, because men are naturally fitter than women for actions of labour and danger. Thirdly, where his own issue faileth, rather a brother than a stranger; and so still the nearer in blood rather than the more remote, because it is always presumed that the nearer of kin is the nearer in affection. And it is evident that a man receives always by reflection the most honour from the greatness of his nearest kindred. But if it be lawful for a monarch to dispose of the succession by words of contract or testament, men may perhaps object a great inconvenience. For he may sell or give his right of governing to a stranger; which, because strangers, that is, men not used to live under the same government, nor speaking the same language, do commonly undervalue one another, may turn to the oppression of his subjects, which is indeed a great inconvenience. But it proceedeth not necessarily from the subjection to a strangers government, but from the unskilfulness of the governors, ignorant of the true rules of politics. And therefore the Romans, when they had subdued many nations, to make their government digestible, were wont to take away that grievance as much as they thought necessary, by giving sometimes to whole nations, and sometimes to principal men of every nation they conquered, not only the privileges, but also the name of Romans, and took many of them into the Senate, and offices of charge, even in the Roman city. And this was it our most wise King, King James, aimed at in endeavouring the union of his two realms of England and Scotland; which, if he could have obtained, had in all likelihood prevented the civil wars which make both those kingdoms at this present miserable. It is not therefore any injury to the people, for a monarch to dispose of the succession by will; though by the fault of many princes it hath been sometimes found inconvenient. Of the lawfulness of it, this also is in argument, that whatsoever inconvenience can arrive by giving a kingdom to a stranger, may arrive also by so marrying with strangers, as the right of succession may descend upon them; yet this by all men is accounted lawful. Chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Leviathan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nikki Sullivan. Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, Chapter 20. Of Dominion Paternal and Despotical. A commonwealth by acquisition is that where the sovereign power is acquired by force, and it is acquired by force when men singly, or many together by plurality of voices, for fear of death or bonds, do authorize all actions of that man or assembly that hath their lives and liberty in his power. And this kind of dominion, or sovereignty, differeth from sovereignty by institution only in this, that men who choose their sovereign do it for fear of one another, and not of him whom they institute. But in this case, they subject themselves to him they are afraid of. In both cases they do it for fear, which is to be noted by them that hold all such covenants, and proceed from fear of death or violence, void, which, if it were true, no man in any commonwealth could be obliged to obedience. It is true that in a commonwealth once instituted or acquired, promises proceeding from fear of death or violence are no covenants, nor obliging, when the thing promised is contrary to the laws. But the reason is not because it was made upon fear, but because he that promiseth hath no right in the thing promised. Also, when he may lawfully perform, and doth not, it is not in the invalidity of the covenant that absolveth him, but the sentence of the sovereign. Otherwise, whensoever a man lawfully promiseth, he unlawfully breaketh. But when the sovereign, who is the actor, acquitteth him, then he is acquitted by him that extorted the promise, as by the author of such absolution. But the rights and consequences of sovereignty are the same in both. His power cannot, without his consent, be transferred to another. He cannot forfeit it. He cannot be accused by any of his subjects of injury. He cannot be punished by them. He is judge of what is necessarily for peace, and judge of doctrines. He is sole legislator, and supreme judge of controversies, and of the times and occasions of war and peace. To him it belongs to choose magistrates, counselors, commanders, and all other officers and ministers, and to determine of rewards and punishments, honor and order, the reasons whereof are the same which are alleged in the precedent chapter, for the same rights and consequences of sovereignty by institution. Dominion is acquired in two ways, by generation and by conquest. The right of the dominion by generation is that which the parent hath over his children, and is called paternal, and is not so derived from the generation, as if therefore the parent had dominion over his child because he begat him, but from the child's consent, either by express or by sufficient arguments declared. For as to the generation, God hath ordained to man a helper, and there be always two that are equally parents. The dominion therefore over the child should belong equally to both, and he be equally subject to both, which is impossible, for no man can obey two masters. And whereas some have attributed the dominion of man only as being of the more excellent sex, they misreckon it. For there is not always that difference of strength or prudence between the man and the woman, as that right can be determined without war. In commonwealths this controversy is decided by the civil law, and for the most part, but not always, the sentence is in favor of the father, because for the most part commonwealths have been erected by fathers, not by the mothers of families. But the question lieth now in the state of mere nature, where there are supposed no laws of matrimony, no laws for the education of children, but the law of nature, and the natural inclination of the sexes, one to another, and to their children. In this condition of mere nature, either the parents between themselves dispose of the dominion over the child by contract, or do not dispose thereof at all. If they dispose thereof, the right passeth according to the contract. We find in history that the Amazons contracted with the men of neighboring countries, to whom they had recourse for issue, that the issue male should be sent back, but the female remain with themselves, so that the dominion of the females was in the mother. If there be no contract, the dominion is in the mother. For in the condition of mere nature, where there are no matrimonial laws, it cannot be known who is the father unless it be declared by the mother. and therefore the right of dominion over the child dependeth on her will, and is consequently hers. Again, seeing the infant is first in the power of the mother, so as she may either nourish or expose it, if she nourish it, she owneth its life to the mother, and is therefore obliged to obey her rather than any other, and by consequence the dominion over it is hers. But if she expose it, and another find and nourish it, dominion is in him that nourish it. For it ought to obey him by whom it is preserved, because preservation of life being the end for which one man becomes subject to another, every man is supposed to promise obedience to him in whose power it is to save or destroy him. If the mother be the father's subject, the child is in the father's power, and if the father be the mother's subject, as when a sovereign queen marrieth one of her subjects, the child is subject to the mother, because the father also is her subject. If a man and woman, monarchs of two several kingdoms, have a child, and contract concerning who shall have dominion of him, the right of dominion passeth by contract. If they contract not, the dominion followeth the dominion of the place of his residence. For the sovereign of each country hath dominion over all that reside therein. He that hath dominion over the child hath dominion also over the children of the child, and over their children's children. For he that hath dominion over the person of a man hath dominion over all that is his, without which dominion were but a title without effect. The right of succession to paternal dominion proceedeth in the same manner as doth the right of succession of monarchy, of which I have already sufficiently spoken in the preceding chapter. Dominion acquired by conquest, or in victory in war, is that which some writers call despotical from despotes, which signifieth a lord or master, and is dominion of the master over his servant. And this dominion is then acquired to the victor when the vanquished, to avoid the present stroke of death, coveteth, either in the express words or by the other sufficient signs of the will, so long as his life, and the liberty of his body, alloweth him. The victor shall have the use thereof at his pleasure. And after such covenant made, the vanquished is a servant, and not before. For the word servant, whether it be derived from servere, to serve, or from servere, to save, which I leave to grammarians to dispute, is not meant a captive, which is kept in prison, or bonds, till the owner of him that took him, or bought him if one that did, shall consider what to do with him. For such men, commonly called slaves, have no obligation at all, but may break their bonds, or the prison, and kill or carry away captive their matter justly, but one that, being taken, hath corporal liberty allowed him, and upon promise not to run away, nor to do violence to his master, is trusted by him. It is not, therefore, the victory that giveth the dominion over the vanquished, but his own covenant. Nor is he obliged because he is conquered, that is to say, beaten or taken or put to flight, but because he cometh in and submitteth to the victor. Nor is the victor obliged by an enemy's rendering himself, without promise of life, to spare him for this his yielding to discretion, which obliges not the victor longer than in his own discretion he shall think fit. And that which men do when they demand, as is now called quarter, which the Greeks called zagria, taking life, is to evade the present fury of the victor by submission, and to compound for their life with ransom or service. And therefore he that hath quarter hath not his life given, but deferred till further deliberation. For it is not a yielding on condition of life, but to discretion. And then only is his life in security, as his service due, when the victor hath trusted him with his corporal liberty. For slaves that work in prisons or fetters do it not of duty, but to avoid the cruelty of their taskmasters. The master of the servant is also master of all that he hath, and may exact the use thereof, that is to say, of his goods, of his labor, of his servants, and of his children, as often as he shall think fit. For he beholdeth his life of his master by the covenant of obedience, that is, of owning and authorizing whatsoever the master shall do. And in the case of the master, if he refuse, kill him, or cast him into bonds, or otherwise punish him for his disobedience, he is himself the author of the same, and cannot accuse him of injury. In sum, the rights and consequences of both paternal and despotical dominion are the very same with those of a sovereign by institution. and for the same reasons, which reasons are set down in the preceding chapter. So that for a man that is monarch of diverse nations, he hath in one the sovereignty by institution of the people assembled, and in another by conquest. That is, by the submission of each particular, to avoid death or bonds, to demand of one nation more than of another, from the title of conquest, as being a conquered nation, is an act of ignorance of the rights of the sovereignty. For the sovereign is absolute over both alike. Or else there is no sovereignty at all, and so every man may lawfully protect himself, if he can, with his own sword, which is the condition of war. By this it appears that a great family, if it be not part of some commonwealth, is of itself, as to the rights of sovereignty, a little monarchy. Whether that family consist of a man and his children, or of a man and his servants, or of a man and his children and servants together, wherein the father or master is the sovereign. But yet a family is not properly a commonwealth, unless it be of that power by its own number, or by other opportunities, as not to be subdued without hazard of war. For where a number of men are manifestly too weak to defend themselves united, every one may use his own reason in time of danger to save his own life, either by flight or by submission to the enemy, as he shall think best. And in the same manner as a very small company of soldiers, surprised by an army, may cast down their arms and demand quarter, or run away, than be put to the sword. And thus much shall suffice concerning what I find by speculation and deduction of sovereign rights from their nature, need, and designs of men in erecting of commonwealths, and putting themselves under monarchs, or assemblies entrusted with power enough for their protection. Let us now consider what the Scripture teacheth in the same point. To Moses the children of Israel say thus, Speak thou to us, and we will hear thee. But let not God speak to us, lest we die. Exodus 20:19. This is absolute obedience to Moses. Concerning the right of kings, God himself, by the mouth of Samuel, saith, This shall be the right of the king you will have to reign over you. He shall take your sons, and set them to drive his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots, and gather in his harvest, and to make his engines of war, and instruments of his chariots, and shall take your daughters to make perfumes, to be his cooks and bakers. He shall take your fields, your vineyards, and your olive yards, and give them to his servants. He shall take the tithe of your corn and wine, and give it to the men of his chamber, and his other servants. He shall take your manservants, and your maidservants, and the choice of your youth, and employ them in his business. He shall take the tithe of your flocks, and you shall be his servants. 1 Samuel 8:11-17. This is absolute power, and summed up in the last words, you shall be his servants. Again, when the people heard what power their king was to have, yet they consented thereto, and say thus, We will be as all other nations, and our king shall judge our causes, and go before us, and conduct our wars. The same, 8:19-20. Here is confirmed the right that sovereigns have, both to the militia and to all judicature, in which is contained an absolute power as one man can possibly transfer to another. Again, the prayer of King Solomon to God was this, Give thy servant understanding to judge thy people and to discern between good and evil. 1 Kings 3:9. It belonged, therefore, to the sovereign to be judge, and to prescribe the rules of discerning good and evil, which rules are laws, and therefore in him is legislative power. Saul sought the life of David, yet when it was in his power to slay Saul, and his servants would have done it, David forbade them. Saul sought the life of David, yet when it was in his power to slay Saul, and his servants would have done it, David forbade them, saying, God forbid I should do such an act against my Lord, the anointed of God. 1 Samuel 24:6. For obedience of servants, St. Paul saith, Servants, obey your masters in all things. Colossians 3:22. And, Children, obey your parents in all things. The same, 3:20. There is simple obedience in those that are subject to paternal or despotical dominion. Again, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' chair, and therefore all that they shall bid you observe, that observe and do. Matthew 23:2-3. There again is simple obedience. And St. Paul warned them that they subject themselves to princes, and to those that are in authority, and obey them. Titus 3:1. This obedience is also simple. Lastly, our Savior himself acknowledges that men ought to pay such taxes as are by kings imposed, where he says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's," and paid such taxes himself, and that the king's word is sufficient to take anything from any subject, when there is need, and that the king is judge of that need, for he himself, as the king of the Jews, commanded his disciples to take the ass and ass's colt, to carry him into Jerusalem, saying, "Go into the village over against you, and you shall find a she-ass tied, and her colt with her. Untie them, and bring them to me. And if any man ask you what you mean by it, say, the Lord hath need of them, and they will let them go." Matthew 21:2-3. They will not ask whether his necessity be a sufficient title, nor whether he be judge of that necessity, but acquiescence in the will of the Lord. To these places may be added also that of Genesis. "You shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." Genesis 3:5. And, "Who told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee thou shouldest not eat?" The same, 3:11. For the cognizance or judicature of good and evil, being forbidden by the name of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, as a trial of Adam's obedience, the devil, to inflame the ambition of the woman, to whom that fruit already seemed beautiful, told her that by tasting it they should be as gods, knowing good and evil. Whereupon, having both eaten, they did indeed take upon them God's office, which is judicature of good and evil, but acquired no new ability to distinguish between them aright. And whereas it is said that, having eaten, they saw they were naked, no man hath so interpreted that place as if they had been formidably blind, and saw not their own skins. The meaning is plain, that it was then they first judged their nakedness, wherein it was God's will to create them to be uncomely, and by being ashamed did tacitly censure God himself. And thereupon God saith, "Hast thou eaten," etc., as if he should say, "Dost thou that owest me obedience take upon thee to judge of my commandments?" Whereby it is clearly, though allegorically, signified that the commands of them that have the right to command are not by their subjects to be censured or disputed. So that it appeareth plainly to my understanding, both from reason and Scripture, that sovereign power, whether placed in one man, as in monarchy, or in one assembly of men, as in popular and aristocratical commonwealth, is as great a possibility men can be imagined to make it. And though of so unlimited a power, men may fancy many evil consequences, yet the consequences of the want of it, which is perpetual war of every man against his neighbor, are much worse. The condition of man in this life shall never be without inconveniences, but there happeneth in no commonwealth any great inconvenience but what proceeds from the subject's disobedience and breach of those covenants from which the commonwealth has its beginning. And whosoever, thinking sovereign power too great, will seek to make it less, must subject himself to that power that can limit it, that is to say, to a greater. The greatest objection is that of the practice, when men ask where and when such power has by subjects been acknowledged. But one may ask them again, when or where has there been a kingdom long free from sedition and civil war? In those nations whose commonwealths have been long lived, and not been destroyed but by foreign war, and subjects never did dispute of the sovereign power. In those nations which commonwealths have been long lived, and not been destroyed but by foreign war, the subjects never did dispute of the sovereign power. But howsoever an argument from the practice of men that have not sifted to the bottom, and with exact reason weighed the causes and nature of commonwealths, and suffered daily those miseries that proceeded from the ignorance thereof, is invalid. For, though in all places of the world men should lay the foundation of their houses on the sand, it could not thence be inferred that so it ought to be. The skill of making and maintaining commonwealths consisteth in certain rules, as doth arithmetic and geometry, not, as tennis play, on practice only; which rules neither poor men had the leisure, nor men have had the leisure have hitherto had the curiosity or the method to find out. End of chapter 20. Recorded by Nikki Sullivan, Chicago.
Chapter 21 of Leviathan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Kirsten Ferreri. Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. Chapter 21 of the Liberty of Subjects. Liberty, what? Liberty, or freedom, signifieth properly the absence of opposition. By opposition I mean external impediments of motion, and may be applied no less to irrational and inanimate creatures than to rational. For whatsoever is so tied or environed as it cannot move but within a certain space, which space is determined by the opposition of some external body, we say it hath not liberty to go further. And so of all living creatures, whilst they are imprisoned or restrained with walls or chains; and of the water, whilst it is kept in by banks or vessels that otherwise would spread itself into a larger space, we use to say, they are not at liberty to move in such a manner, as without those external impediments they would. But when the impediment of motion is in the constitution of the thing itself, we use not to say, it wants the liberty, but the power to move; as when a stone lieth still, or a man is fastened to his bed by sickness. What it is to be free. And according to this proper and generally received meaning of the word, a free man is he that in those things which by his strength and wit he is able to do, is not hindered to do what he has a will to. But when the words free and liberty are applied to anything but bodies, they are abused, for that which is not subject to motion is not subject to impediment; and therefore, when 'tis said, for example, the way is free, no liberty of the way is signified, but of those that walk in it without stop. And when we say a gift is free, there is not meant any liberty of the gift, but of the giver, that was not bound by any law or covenant to give it. So when we speak freely, it is not the liberty of voice or pronunciation, but of the man whom no law hath obliged to speak otherwise than he did. Lastly, from the use of the word free will, no liberty can be inferred to the will, desire, or inclination, but the liberty of the man, which consisteth in this, that he finds no stop in doing what he has the will, desire, or inclination to do. Fear and liberty consistent. Fear and liberty are consistent, as when a man throweth his goods into the sea for fear the ship should sink; he doth it nevertheless very willingly, and may refuse to do it if he will. It is therefore the action of one that was free; so a man sometimes pays his debt only for fear of imprisonment, which, because no body hindered him from detaining, was the action of a man at liberty. And generally all actions men do in commonwealths for fear of the law, or actions which the doers had liberty to omit. Liberty and necessity consistent. Liberty and necessity are consistent, as in the water that hath not only liberty, but a necessity of descending by the channel; so likewise in the actions which men voluntarily do, which, because they proceed from their will, proceed from liberty; and yet because every act of man's will, and every desire and inclination proceedeth from some cause, which cause is in a continual chain, whose first link in the hand of the God the first of all causes, proceed from necessity. So that to him that could see the connexion of those causes, the necessity of all men's voluntary actions would appear manifest; and therefore God, that seeth and disposeth all things, seeth also that the liberty of man in doing what he will, is accompanied with the necessity of doing that which God will, and no more nor less. For though men may do many things, which God does not command, nor is therefore author of them, yet they can have no passion, nor appetite to any thing, of which appetite Gods will is not the cause. And did not his will assure the necessity of mans will, and consequently of all that on mans will dependeth, the liberty of man would be a contradiction, and impediment to the omnipotence and liberty of God. And this shall suffice, as to the matter in hand of that naturall liberty, which only properly is called liberty. Artificial bonds, or covenants. But as men, for the attaining of peace, and conservation of themselves thereby, have made an artificial man, which we call a Common-wealth; so also have they made artificial chains, called Civill Lawes, which they themselves by mutual covenants have fastened at one end, to the lips of that man, or Assembly, to whom they have given the Soveraign Power; and at the other end, to their own ears. These bonds, in their own nature but weak, may nevertheless be made to hold by the danger, though not by the difficulty of breaking them. Liberty of subjects consisteth of liberty from covenants. In relation to these bonds only it is that I am to speak now of the liberty of subjects. For seeing there is no Common-wealth in the world for the regulating of all the actions and words of men, as being a thing impossible, it followeth necessarily, that in all kinds of actions, by the laws pretermitted, men have the liberty of doing what their own reason shall suggest, for the most profitable to themselves. For if we take liberty in the proper sense for corporal liberty, that is to say, freedom from chains and prison, it were very absurd for men to clamour as they do for liberty they so manifestly enjoy. Again, if we take liberty for an exemption from laws, it is no less absurd, for men to demand as they do that liberty, by which all other men may be masters of their lives. And yet as absurd as it is, this is it they demand, not knowing that the laws are of no power to protect them, without a sword in the hands of a man or men to cause those laws to be put in execution. The liberty of a subject lieth therefore only in those things, which in regulating their actions the Soveraign hath pretermitted; such as is the liberty to buy and sell, and otherwise contract with one another; to choose their own abode, their own diet, their own trade of life, and institute their children, as they themselves think fit, and the like. Liberty of the subject, consistent with the unlimited power of the Soveraign. Nevertheless, we are not to understand, that by such liberty, the Soveraign power of life and death is either abolished, or limited. For it has already been shewn, that nothing the Soveraign Representative can do to a subject, on what pretence soever, can properly be called injustice, or injury; because every subject is author of every act the Soveraign doth, so that he never wanteth right to any thing, otherwise, than as he himself is the subject of God, and bound thereby to observe the laws of nature. And therefore it may, and doth often happen, in Common-wealths, that a subject may be put to death by the command of the Soveraign Power, and yet neither do the other wrong, as when Jephthah caused his daughter to be sacrificed; in which and the like cases, he that so dieth hath liberty to do the action, for which he is nevertheless without injury put to death. And the same holdeth also in a Soveraign Prince, that putteth to death an innocent subject. For though the action be against the law of nature, as being contrary to equity, as was the killing of Uriah by David, yet it was not an injury to Uriah, but to God. Not to Uriah, because the right to do what he pleased was given him by Uriah himself; and yet to God, because David was Gods subject, and prohibited all iniquity by the law of nature. Which distinction David himself, when he repented the fact, evidently confirmed, saying, "To thee only have I sinned." In the same manner the people of Athens, when they banished the most potent of their Commonwealth for 10 years, thought they had committed no injustice; and yet they never questioned what crime he had done, but what hurt he would do. Nay, they commanded the banishment of they knew not whom; and every citizen bringing his oyster shell into the marketplace, written with the name of him he desired should be banished, without actual accusing him, sometime banished an Aristides for his reputation of justice, and sometimes a scurrilous jester, as Hyperbolus, to make a jest of it. And yet a man cannot say the sovereign people of Athens wanted right to banish them, or an Athenian the liberty to jest, or to be just. The liberty which writers praise is the liberty of sovereigns, not of private men. The liberty whereof there is so frequent and honourable mention in the histories and philosophy of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and in the writings and discourse of those that from them have received all their learning in the politics, is not the liberty of particular men, but the liberty of the commonwealth, which is the same with that which every man then should have, if there were no civil laws nor commonwealth at all; and the effects of it also be the same. For as among masterless men there is perpetual war, of every man against his neighbour, no inheritance to transmit to the son, nor to expect from the father, no propriety of goods or lands, no security, but a full and absolute liberty in every man; so in states and commonwealths not dependent on one another, every commonwealth, not every man, has an absolute liberty to do what it shall judge, that is to say, what that man or assembly that representeth it shall judge, most conducing to their benefit. But withal, they live in the condition of a perpetual war, and upon the confines of battle, with their frontiers armed, and cannons planted against their neighbours round about. The Athenians and Romans were free, that is, free commonwealths; not that any particular men had the liberty to resist their own representative, but that their representative had the liberty to resist or invade other people. There is written on the turrets of the city of Lucca in great characters at this day the word Libertas; yet no man can thence infer that a particular man has more liberty or immunity from the service of the commonwealth there than in Constantinople. Whether a commonwealth be monarchical or popular, the freedom is still the same. But it is an easy thing for men to be deceived by the specious name of liberty, and for want of judgment to distinguish, mistake that for their private inheritance and birthright, which is the right of the public only. And when the same error is conferred by the authority of men in reputation for their writings in this subject, it is no wonder if it produce sedition and change of government. In these western parts of the world, we are made to receive our opinions concerning the institution and rights of commonwealths from Aristotle, Cicero, and other men, Greeks and Romans, that living under popular states, derived those rights, not from the principles of nature, but transcribed them into their books, out of the practice of their own commonwealths, which were popular, as the grammarians describe the rules of language out of the practice of the time, or the rules of poetry out of the poems of Homer and Virgil. And because the Athenians were taught, to keep them from desire of changing their government, that they were freemen, and all that lived under monarchy were slaves, therefore Aristotle puts it down in his Politics, Book 6, Chapter 2. In democracy liberty is to be supposed, for 'tis commonly held that no man is free in any other government. And as Aristotle, so Cicero and other writers have grounded their civil doctrine on the opinions of the Romans, who were taught to hate monarchy at first by them that, having deposed their sovereign, shared amongst them the sovereignty of Rome, and afterwards by their successors. And by reading of these Greek and Latin authors, men from their childhood have gotten a habit, under a false show of liberty, of favouring tumults, and of licentious controlling the actions of their sovereigns, and again of controlling those controllers, with the effusion of so much blood, as I think I may truly say, there was never anything so dearly bought as these western parts have bought the learning of the Greek and Latin tongues. Liberty of the subject how to be measured. To come now to the particulars of the true liberty of a subject, that is to say, what are the things which, though commanded by the sovereign, he may nevertheless without injustice refuse to do, we are to consider what rights we pass away when we make a commonwealth; or, which is all one, what liberty we deny ourselves by owning all the actions without exception of the man or assembly we make our sovereign. For in the act of our submission consisteth both our obligation and our liberty, which must therefore be inferred by arguments taken from thence, there being no obligation on any man which ariseth not from some act of his own, for all men equally are by nature free. And because such arguments must either be drawn from the express words, I authorize all his actions, or from the intention of him that submitteth himself to his power, which intention is to be understood by the end for which he so submitteth, the obligation and liberty of the subject is to be derived either from those words or others equivalent, or else from the end of the institution of sovereignty, namely, the peace of the subjects within themselves, and their defence against a common enemy. Subjects have liberty to defend their own bodies, even against them that lawfully invade them. First, therefore, seeing sovereignty by institution is by covenant of every one to every one, and sovereignty by acquisition, by covenants of the vanquished to the victor, or child to the parent, it is manifest that every subject has liberty in all those things, the right whereof cannot by covenant be transferred. I have shown before in the 14th chapter, that covenants, not to defend a man's own body, are void. Therefore, if the sovereign command a man, though justly condemned, to kill, wound, or maim himself, or not to resist those that assault him, or to abstain from the use of food, air, medicine, or any other thing without which he cannot live, yet hath that man the liberty to disobey. Again, if a man be interrogated by the sovereign or his authority concerning a crime done by himself, he is not bound without assurance of pardon to confess it, because no man, as I have shown in the same chapter, can be obliged by covenant to accuse himself. Again, the consent of a subject to sovereign power is contained in these words: I authorize or take upon me all his actions, in which there is no restriction at all of his former natural liberty. For by allowing him to kill me, I am not bound to kill myself when he commands me. 'Tis one thing to say, kill me or my fellow, if you please; another thing to say, I will kill myself or my fellow. It followeth therefore that no man is bound by the words themselves either to kill himself or any other man, and consequently that the obligation a man may sometimes have upon the command of the sovereign to execute any dangerous or dishonorable office dependeth not on the words of our submission, but on the intention, which is to be understood by the end thereof. When, therefore, our refusal to obey frustrates the end for which the sovereignty was ordained, then there is no liberty to refuse. Otherwise there is. Upon this ground, a man that is commanded, as a soldier, to fight against the enemy, though his sovereign have right enough to punish his refusal with death, may nevertheless in many cases refuse without injustice, as when he substituteth a sufficient soldier in his place. For in this case he deserteth not the service of the commonwealth. And there is allowance to be made for natural timorousness, not only to women, of whom no such dangerous duty is expected, but also to men of feminine courage. When armies fight, there is on one side or both a running away. Yet when they do it not out of treachery but fear, they are not esteemed to do it unjustly, but dishonorably. For the same reason, to avoid battle is not injustice, but cowardice. But he that enrolleth himself a soldier, or taketh impressed money, taketh away the excuse of a timorous nature, and is obliged not only to go to the battle, but also not to run from it, without his captain's leave. And when the defence of the commonwealth requireth at once the help of all that are able to bear arms, every one is obliged, because otherwise the institution of the commonwealth, which they have not the purpose or courage to preserve, was in vain. To resist the sword of the commonwealth in defence of another man, guilty or innocent, no man hath liberty, because such liberty takes away from the sovereign the means of protecting us, and is therefore destructive of the very essence of government. But in case a great many men together have already resisted the sovereign power unjustly, or committed some capital crime for which every one of them expecteth death, whether have they not the liberty then to join together and assist, and defend one another? Certainly they have. For they but defend their lives, which the guilty man may as well do as the innocent. There was indeed injustice in the first breach of their duty. Their bearing of arms subsequent to it, though it be to maintain what they have done, is no new unjust act, and if it be only to defend their persons, it is not unjust at all. But the offer of pardon taketh from them to whom it is offered the plea of self-defence, and maketh their persevering in assisting or defending the rest unlawful. The greatest liberty of subjects dependeth on the silence of the law. As for other liberties, they depend on the silence of the law. In cases where the sovereign has prescribed no rule, there the subject hath the liberty to do or forbear according to his own discretion. And therefore such liberty is in some places more, and in some less, and in some times more, in other times less, according as they that have the sovereignty shall think most convenient. As for example, there was a time when in England a man might enter into his own land, and dispossess such as wrongfully possessed it, by force. But in after times that liberty of forcible entry was taken away by a statute made by the king in Parliament. And in some places of the world men have the liberty of many wives; in other places such liberty is not allowed. If a subject have a controversy with his sovereign of debt, or of right of possession of lands or goods, or concerning any service required at his hands, or concerning any penalty corporal or pecuniary, grounded on a precedent law, he hath the same liberty to sue for his right as if it were against a subject, and before such judges as are appointed by the sovereign. For seeing the sovereign demandeth by force of a former law, and not by virtue of his power, he declareth thereby that he requireth no more than shall appear to be due by that law. The suit therefore is not contrary to the will of the sovereign, and consequently the subject hath the liberty to demand the hearing of his cause, and sentence according to that law. But if he demand or take anything by pretence of his power, there lieth in that case no action of law. For all that is done by him in virtue of his power is done by the authority of every subject, and consequently he that brings an action against the sovereign brings it against himself. If a monarch or sovereign assembly grant a liberty to all, or any of his subjects, which grant standing he is disabled to provide for their safety, the grant is void, unless he directly renounce or transfer the sovereignty to another. For in that he might openly, if it had been his will, and in plain terms, have renounced or transferred it, and did not. It is to be understood it was not his will, but that the grant proceeded from ignorance of the repugnancy between such a liberty and the sovereign power, and therefore the sovereignty is still retained, and consequently all those powers which are necessary to the exercising thereof, such as the power of war and peace, of judicature, of appointing officers and counsellors, of levying money, and the rest named in the 18th chapter. In what cases subjects are absolved of their obedience to their sovereign. The obligation of subjects to the sovereign is understood to last as long, and no longer, than the power lasteth, by which he is able to protect them. For the right men have by nature to protect themselves, when none else can protect them, can by no covenant be relinquished. The sovereignty is the soul of the commonwealth, which once departed from the body, the members do no more receive their motion from it. The end of obedience is protection, which wheresoever a man seeth it, either in his own or in another's sword, nature applieth his obedience to it, and his endeavour to maintain it. And though sovereignty, in the intention of them that make it, be immortal, yet is it in its own nature not only subject to violent death by foreign war, but also through the ignorance and passions of men. It hath in it from the very institution many seeds of a natural mortality, by intestine discord. In case of captivity. If a subject be taken prisoner in war, or his person or his means of life be within the guards of the enemy, and hath his life and corporal liberty given him on condition to be subject to the victor, he hath liberty to accept the condition, and having accepted it, is the subject of him that took him, because he had no other way to preserve himself. The case is the same if he be detained in a foreign country, on the same terms. But if a man be held in prison or bonds, or is not trusted with the liberty of his body, he cannot be understood to be bound by covenant to subjection, and therefore may, if he can, make his escape by any means whatsoever. In case the sovereign cast off the government from himself and his heirs. If a monarch shall relinquish the sovereignty both for himself and his heirs, his subjects return to the absolute liberty of nature. Because, though nature may declare who are his sons, and who are his nearest of kin, yet it dependeth on his own will, as hath been said in the precedent chapter, who shall be his heir. If therefore he will have no heir, there is no sovereignty nor subjection. The case is the same if he die without known kindred, and without declaration of his heir. For then there can no heir be known, and consequently no subjection be due. In case of banishment. If the sovereign banish his subject, during the banishment he is not subject. But he that is sent on a message, or hath leave to travel, is still subject. But it is by contract between sovereigns, not by virtue of the covenant of subjection. For whosoever entereth into another's dominion is subject to all the laws thereof, unless he have a privilege by the amity of the sovereigns, or by special license. In case the sovereign render himself subject to another. If a monarch, subdued by war, render himself subject to the victor, his subjects are delivered from their former obligation, and become obliged to the victor. But if he be held prisoner, or have not the liberty of his own body, he is not understood to have given away the right of sovereignty, and therefore his subjects are obliged to yield obedience to the magistrates formerly placed, governing not in their name, but in his. For his right remaining, the question is only of the administration, that is to say, of the magistrates and officers, which if he have not means to name, he is supposed to approve those which he himself had formerly appointed. Chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of Leviathan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leon Meyer. Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. Chapter 22. Of System Subject, Political, and Private. Having spoken of the generation, form, and power of a commonwealth, I am in order to speak next of the parts thereof. And first of systems, which resemble the similar parts or muscles of a body natural. By systems I understand any numbers of men joined in one interest or one business, of which some are regular and some irregular. Regular are those where one man, or assembly of men, is constituted representative of the whole number. All other are irregular. Of regular, some are absolute and independent, subject to none but their own representative. Such are only commonwealths, of which I have spoken already in the 5 last precedent chapters. Others are dependent, that is to say, subordinate to some sovereign power, to which everyone, as also their representative, is subject. Of systems subordinate, some are political, and some private. Political, otherwise called bodies politic and persons in law, are those which are made by authority from the sovereign power of the commonwealth. Private are those which are constituted by subjects among themselves, or by authority from a stranger. For no authority derived from foreign power within the dominion of another is public there, but private. And of private systems, some are lawful, some unlawful. Lawful are those which are allowed by the commonwealth. All other are unlawful. Irregular systems are those which, having no representative, consist only in concourse of people, which, if not forbidden by the commonwealth, nor made on evil design, such as are conflux of people to markets or shows, or any other harmless end, are lawful. But when the intention is evil, or, if the number be considerable, unknown, they are unlawful. In bodies politic, the power of the representative is always limited, and that which prescribeth the limits thereof is the power sovereign. For power unlimited is absolute sovereignty, and the sovereign in every commonwealth is the absolute representative of all the subjects, and therefore no other can be representative of any part of them, but so far as he shall give leave. And to give leave to a body politic of subjects to have an absolute representative, to all intents and purposes, were to abandon the government of so much of the commonwealth, and to divide the dominion, contrary to their peace and defense, which the sovereign cannot be understood to do by any grant that does not plainly and directly discharge them of their subjection. For consequences of words are not the signs of his will, when other consequences are signs of the contrary, but rather signs of error and misreckoning, to which all mankind is too prone. The bounds of that power which is given to the representative of a body politic are to be taken notice of from 2 things. One is their writ, or letters from the sovereign; the other is the law of the commonwealth. For though in the institution or acquisition of a commonwealth, which is independent, there needs no writing, because the power of the representative has there no other bounds but such as are set out by the unwritten law of nature, yet in subordinate bodies there are such diversities of limitation necessary concerning their businesses, times, and places, as can neither be remembered without letters, nor taken notice of, unless such letters be patent, that they may be read to them, and withal sealed or testified, with the seals or other permanent signs of the authority sovereign. And because such limitation is not always easy or perhaps possible to be described in writing, the ordinary laws, common to all subjects, must determine what the representative may lawfully do in all cases where the letters themselves are silent. And therefore, in a body politic, if the representative be one man, whatsoever he does in the person of the body, which is not warranted in his letters, nor by the laws, is his own act, and not the act of the body, nor of any other member thereof besides himself; because, further than his letters or the laws limit, he representeth no man's person but his own. But what he does according to these is the act of every one. For of the act of the sovereign every one is author, because he is their representative unlimited; and the act of him that recedes not from the letters of the sovereign is the act of the sovereign, and therefore every member of the body is author of it. But if the representative be an assembly, whatsoever that assembly shall decree, not warranted by their letters or the laws, is the act of the assembly, or body politic, and the act of every one by whose vote the decree was made; but not the act of any man that being present voted to the contrary, nor of any man absent, unless he voted it by procreation. It is the act of the assembly because voted by the major part; and if it be a crime, the assembly may be punished, as far forth as it is capable, as by dissolution, or forfeiture of their letters, which is to such artificial and fictitious bodies capital; or if the assembly have a common stock, wherein none of the innocent members have propriety, by pecuniary mulct. For from corporal penalties nature hath exempted all bodies politic; but they that gave not their vote are therefore innocent, because the assembly cannot represent any man in things unwarranted by their letters, and consequently are not involved in their votes. If the person of the body politic, being in one man, borrow money of a stranger, that is, of one that is not of the same body, for no letters need limit borrowing, seeing it is left to men's own inclinations to limit lending, the debt is the representative's. For if he should have authority from his letters to make the members pay what he borroweth, he should have by consequence the sovereignty of them, and therefore the grant were either void, as proceeding from error commonly incident to human nature, and as an insufficient sign of the will of the grantor; or if it be avowed by him, then it is the representer sovereign, and falleth not under the present question, which is only of bodies subordinate. No member, therefore, is obliged to pay the debt so borrowed, but the representative himself; because he that lendeth it, being a stranger to the letters, and to the qualification of the body, understandeth those only for his debtors that are engaged; and seeing the representer can engage himself, and none else, has him only debtor, who must therefore pay him, out of the common stock, if there be any, or if there be none, out of his own estate. If he come into debt by contract or mulct, the case is the same. But when the representative is an assembly, and the debt to a stranger, all they, and only they, are responsible for the debt that gave their votes to the borrowing of it, or to the contract that made it due, or to the fact for which the mulct was imposed; because every one of those, in voting, did engage himself for the payment. For he that is author of the borrowing is obliged to the payment, even of the whole debt, though when paid by any one he be discharged. But if the debt be to one of the assembly only is obliged to the payment out of their common stock, if they have any; for having liberty of vote, if he vote the money shall be borrowed, he votes it shall be paid; if he vote it shall not be borrowed, or be absent, yet because in lending he voteth the borrowing, he contradicteth his former vote, and is obliged by the latter, and becomes both borrower and lender, and consequently cannot demand payment from any particular man, but from the common treasury only; which failing, he hath no remedy, nor complaint but against himself, that being privy to the acts of the assembly, and to their means to pay, and not being enforced, did nevertheless through his own folly lend his money. It is manifest by this, that in bodies politic subordinate, and subject to a sovereign power, it is sometimes not only lawful, but expedient, for a particular man to make open protestation against the decrees of the representative assembly, and cause their dissent to be registered, or to take witness of it; because otherwise they may be obliged to pay debts contracted, and be responsible for crimes committed by other men. But in a sovereign assembly that liberty is taken away, both because he that protesteth there denies their sovereignty, and also because whatsoever is commanded by the sovereign power is as to the subject, though not always in the sight of God, justified by the command. For of such command every subject is the author. The variety of bodies politic is almost infinite. For they are not only distinguished by the several affairs for which they are constituted, wherein there is an unspeakable diversity, but also by the times, places, and numbers, subject to many limitations. And as to their affairs, some are ordained for government; as first, the government of a province may be committed to an assembly of men, wherein all resolutions shall depend on the votes of the major part; and then this assembly is a body politic, and their power limited by commission. This word province signifies a charge or care of business, which he whose business it is, committeth to another man to be administered for and under him. And therefore, when in one commonwealth there be divers countries that have their laws distinct from one another, or are far distant in place, the administration of the government being committed to divers persons, those countries where the sovereign is not resident, but governs by commission, are called provinces. But of the government of a province, by an assembly residing in the province itself, there be few examples. The Romans, who had the sovereignty of many provinces, yet governed them always by presidents and praetors, and not by assemblies, as they governed the city of Rome and territories adjacent. In like manner, when there were colonies sent from England to plant Virginia and Summer Islands, though the government of them here were committed to assemblies in London, yet did those assemblies never commit the government under them to any assembly there, but did to each plantation send one governor. For though every man, where he can be present by nature, desires to participate of government, yet where they cannot be present, they are by nature also inclined to commit the government of their common interest rather to a monarchical than a popular form of government. Which is also evident in those men that have a great private estates, who, when they are unwilling to take the pains of administering the business that belongs to them, choose rather to trust one servant than an assembly either of their friends or servants. But howsoever it be in fact, yet we may suppose the government of a province or colony committed to an assembly. And when it is, that which in this place I have to say is this, that whatsoever debt is by that assembly contracted, or whatsoever unlawful act is decreed, is the act only of those that assented, and not of any that dissented, or were absent, for the reasons before alleged. Also that an assembly residing out of the bounds of that colony, whereof they have the government, cannot execute any power over the persons or goods of any of the colony, to seize on them for debt, or other duty, in any place without the colony itself, as having no jurisdiction nor authority elsewhere, but are left to the remedy which the law of the place alloweth them. And though the assembly have right to impose mulct upon any of their members that shall break the laws they make, yet out of the colony itself they have no right to execute the same. And that which is said here of the rights of an assembly for the government of a province or a colony is applicable also to an assembly for the government of a town, a university, or a college, or a church, or for any government over the persons of men. And generally, in all bodies politic, if any particular member conceive himself injured by the body itself, the cognizance of his cause belong to the sovereign, and those the sovereign hath ordained for judges in such causes, or shall ordain for that particular cause, and not to the body itself. For the whole body is in this case his fellow subject, which in a sovereign assembly is otherwise. For there, if the sovereign be not judge, though in his own cause, there can be no judge at all. In a body politic, for the well ordering of foreign traffic, the most commodious representative is an assembly of all the members, that is to say, such a one as every one that adventureth his money may be present at all the deliberations and resolutions of the body, if they will themselves. For proof whereof, we are to consider the end for which men that are merchants, and may buy and sell, export and import their merchandise according to their own discretions, do nevertheless bind themselves up in one corporation. It is true, there be few merchants that with the merchandise they buy at home can freight a ship to export it, or with that they buy abroad to bring it home, and have therefore need to join together in one society, where every man may either participate of the gain according to the proportion of his adventure, or take his own and sell what he transports or imports at such prices as he thinks fit. But this is no body politic, there being no common representative to oblige them to any other law than that which is common to all other subjects. The end of their incorporating is to make their gain the greater, which is done two ways, by sole buying and sole selling, both at home and abroad. So that to grant to a company of merchants to be a corporation, or body politic, is to grant them a double monopoly, whereof one is to be sole buyers, another to be sole sellers. For when there is a company incorporate for any particular foreign country, they only export the commodities vendible in that country, which is sole buying at home and sole selling abroad. For at home there is but one buyer, and abroad but one that selleth, both which is gainful to the merchant, because thereby they buy at home at lower, and sell abroad at higher rates. And abroad there is but one buyer of foreign merchandise, and but one that sells them at home, both which again are gainful to the adventurers. Of this double monopoly, one part is disadvantageous to the people at home, the other to foreigners. For at home, by their sole exportation, they set what price they please on the husbandry and handiworks of the people, and by the sole importation, what price they please on all foreign commodities the people have need of, both which are ill for the people. On the contrary, by the sole selling of the native commodities abroad, and sole buying the foreign commodities upon the place, they raise the price of those, and abate the price of these, to the disadvantage of the foreigner. For where but one selleth, the merchandise is the dearer, and where but one buyeth, the cheaper. Such corporations, therefore, are no other than monopolies, though they would be very profitable for a commonwealth, if, being bound up into one body in foreign markets, they were at liberty at home, every man to buy and sell at what price he could. The end, then, of these bodies of merchants, being not a common benefit to the whole body, which have in this case no common stock, but what is deducted out of the particular adventures, for building, buying, victualling, and manning of ships, but the particular gain of every adventurer, it is reason that every one be acquainted with the employment of his own, that is, that every one be of the assembly that shall have the power to order the same, and be acquainted with their accounts. And therefore the representative of such a body must be an assembly, where every member of the body may be present at the consultations, if he will. If a body politic of merchants contract a debt to a stranger by the act of their representative assembly, every member is liable by himself for the whole. For a stranger can take no notice of their private laws, but considereth them as so many particular men, obliged every one to the whole payment, till payment made by one dischargeth all the rest. But if the debt be to one of the company, the creditor is debtor for the whole to himself, and cannot therefore demand his debt, but only from the common stock, if there be any. If the commonwealth impose a tax upon the body, it is understood to be laid upon every member proportionally to his particular adventure in the company; for there is in this case no other common stock but what is made of their particular adventures. If a mulct be laid upon the body for some unlawful act, they are only liable by whose votes the act was decreed, or by whose assistance it was executed; for in none of the rest is there any other crime but being of the body, which, if a crime, because the body was ordained by the authority of the commonwealth, is not his. If one of the members be indebted to the body, he may be sued by the body, but his goods cannot be taken, nor his person imprisoned by the authority of the body, but only by authority of the commonwealth; for they can do it by their own authority; they can by their own authority give judgment that the debt is due, which is as much as to be judge in their own cause. These bodies, made for the government of men, or of traffic, be either perpetual, or for a time prescribed by writing. But there be bodies also whose times are limited, and that only by the nature of their business. For example, if a sovereign monarch, or a sovereign assembly, shall think fit to give command to the towns, and other several parts of their territory, to send to him their deputies, to inform him of the condition and necessities of the subjects, or to advise with him for the making of good laws, or for any other cause, as with one person representing the whole country, such deputies, having a place and time of meeting assigned them, are there and at that time a body politic, representing every subject of that dominion; but it is only for such matters as shall be propounded unto them by that man, or assembly that by the sovereign authority sent for them; and when it shall be declared that nothing more shall be propounded, nor debated by them, the body is dissolved. For if they were the absolute representative of the people, then were it the sovereign assembly, and so there would be two sovereign assemblies, or two sovereigns over the same people, which cannot consist with their peace. And therefore where there is once a sovereignty, there can be no absolute representation of the people but by it. And for the limits of how far such a body shall represent the whole people, they are set forth in the writing by which they were sent for. For the people cannot choose their deputies to other intent than is in the writing directed to them from their sovereign expressed. Private bodies regular and lawful are those that are constituted without letters, or other written authority, saving the laws common to all other subjects; and because they be united in one person representative, they are held for regular; such as are all families, in which the father or master ordereth the whole family; for he obligeth his children and servants as far as the law permitteth, though not further, because none of them are bound to obedience in those actions which the law hath forbidden to be done. In all other actions, during the time they are under domestic government, they are subject to their fathers and masters, as to their immediate sovereigns. For the father and master being before the institution of commonwealth absolute sovereigns in their own families, they lose afterward no more of their authority than the law of the commonwealth taketh from them. Private bodies regular, but unlawful, are those that unite themselves into one person representative, without any public authority at all; such as are the corporations of beggars, thieves, and gypsies, the better to order their trade of begging and stealing; and the corporations of men that by authority from any foreign person themselves in another's dominion, for the easier propagation of doctrines, and for making a party against the power of the commonwealth. Irregular systems, in their nature but leagues, or sometimes mere concourse of people without union to any particular design, not by obligation of one to another, but proceeding only from a similitude of wills and inclinations, become lawful or unlawful according to the lawfulness or unlawfulness of every man's particular design therein, and his design is to be understood by the occasion. The leagues of subjects, because leagues are commonly made for mutual defense, are in a commonwealth, which is no more than a league of all the subjects together; for the most part unnecessary, and savour of unlawful design, and are for that cause unlawful, and commonly go by the name of factions, or conspiracies. For a league, being a connection of men by covenants, if there be no power given to any one man or assembly, as in the condition of mere nature, to compel them to performance, is so long only valid, as there ariseth no just cause of distrust; and therefore leagues between commonwealths, over whom there is no human power established to keep them all in awe, are not only lawful, but also profitable for the time they last. But leagues of the subjects of one and the same commonwealth, where every one may obtain his right by means of the sovereign power, are unnecessary to the maintaining of peace and justice, and in case the design of them be evil or unknown to the commonwealth, unlawful. For all uniting of strength by private men is, if for evil intent, unjust; if for intent unknown, dangerous to the public, and unjustly concealed. If the sovereign power be in a great assembly, and a number of men, part of the assembly, without authority consult apart to contrive the guidance of the rest, this is a faction or conspiracy unlawful, as being a fraudulent seducing of the assembly for their particular interest. But if he whose private interest is to be debated and judged in the assembly make as many friends as he can, in him it is no injustice, because in this case he is no part of the assembly. And though he hire such friends with money, unless there be an express law against it, yet it is not injustice. For sometimes, as men's manners are, justice cannot be had without money, and every man may think his own cause just, till it be heard and judged. In all commonwealths, if a private man entertain more servants than the government of his estate and lawful employment he has for them requires, it is faction, and unlawful. For having the protection of the commonwealth, he needeth not the defence of private force. And whereas in nations not thoroughly civilized, several numerous families have lived in continual hostility, and invaded one another with private force, yet it is evident enough that they have done unjustly, or else that they had no commonwealth. And as factions for kindred, so also factions for government of religion, as of Papists, Protestants, etc., or of state, as patricians and plebeians of old time in Rome, and of aristocraticals and democraticals of old time in Greece, are unjust, as being contrary to the peace and safety of the people, and a taking of the sword out of the hand of the sovereign. Concourse of people is an irregular system, the lawfulness or unlawfulness whereof dependeth on the occasion, and on the number of them that are assembled. If the occasion be lawful and manifest, the concourse is lawful, as the usual meeting of men at church or at a public show, in usual numbers. For if the numbers be extraordinarily great, the occasion is not evident, and consequently he that cannot render a particular and good account of his being amongst them is to be judged conscious of an unlawful and tumultuous design. It may be lawful for 1,000 men to join in a petition to be delivered to a judge or magistrate, yet if 1,000 men come to present it, it is a tumultuous assembly, because there needs but 1 or 2 for that purpose. But in such cases as these, it is not a set number that makes the assembly unlawful, but such a number as the present officers are not able to suppress and bring to justice. When an unusual number of men assemble against a man whom they accuse, the assembly is an unlawful tumult, because they may deliver their accusation to the magistrate by a few, or by one man. Such was the case of St. Paul of Ephesus, where Demetrius and a great number of other men brought 2 of Paul's companions before the magistrate, saying with one voice, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians," which was their way of demanding justice against them for teaching the people such doctrine as was against their religion and trade. The occasion here, considering the laws of that people, was just. Yet was their assembly judged unlawful, and the magistrate reprehended them for it, in these words, If Demetrius and the other workmen can accuse any man of anything, there be pleas and deputies. Let them accuse one another. And if you have any other thing to demand, your case may be judged in an assembly lawfully called. For we are in danger to be accused for this day's sedition, because there is no cause by which any man can render any reason of this concourse of people. Unquote. Acts 19:40. Where he calleth an assembly whereof men can give no just account, a sedition, and such as they could not answer for. And this is all I shall say concerning systems, and assemblies of people, which may be compared, as I said, to the similar parts of man's body, such as be lawful to the muscles, such as are unlawful to winds, biles, and apostems, engendered by the unnatural conflux of evil humours. End of chapter 22.